Karoline Leavitt flees the country. After Crockett 80M lawsuit process speed up. Karoline Leavitt was expected in court at 9:00 a.m. by noon. She was on a plane to Zurich, leaving behind a storm of unanswered questions, frozen assets, and a courtroom stunned into silence. It started with a name missing from a court schedule. Tuesday morning, 8:33 a.m., U.S. District Court in downtown San Diego. The clerk had just called out Karoline Leavitt, expecting a quick confirmation for a scheduled deposition tied to rapper Jasmine Crockett's $80 million lawsuit. But the response wasn't what anyone expected. "Not present, Your Honor," a junior associate mumbled from behind a stack of files. A ripple of glances darted across the room. The judge didn't speak at first. He just looked over the rim of his glasses and waited. Someone in the back whispered, "She's dodging outside the courthouse." Media vans were already lined up, assuming they'd get a few words from Leavitt after the hearing reporters checked their texts, looking confused. No sighting, no car, no post on social, just nothing. Then the first whisper came through. A TSA agent out of JFK had messaged a political blogger on Twitter. "Think I just saw Karoline Leavitt board a flight to Zurich." Name didn't match, but it was her. She looked nervous. No one knew what to make of it, at least not yet. At 10:00 a.m., an image began to circulate grainy from someone's phone. A woman in dark glasses, navy blazer, dragging a carry-on near Gate 14 at JFK's terminal. 7, her posture was stiff. Not panicked, but she wasn't smiling either. A second image showed her speaking with a man in a dark hoodie. No one recognizable, but the timestamp matched. She was there by noon. Confirmation came from an anonymous source inside a regional law enforcement office. She used a diplomatic contact to get on that plane under a different name. Charter route, private clearance. The court was still in session when the judge was handed a printed version of the image. He looked at it for 3 seconds. "If this is verified," he said, "we're shifting course," inside the courtroom. Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. She didn't flinch. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something, but she didn't respond. Her hands were locked in her lap. Outside the sidewalk, crowd had swelled, microphones everywhere. Headlines were already changing. What had been legal showdown between Crockett and Leavitt was suddenly Karoline Leavitt flees deposition. But this wasn't some viral PR stunt. This was federal court, and people were starting to understand what might be at stake. A local journalist named Reed Bowen, who'd covered Leavitt during her time as a White House staffer, went live on his independent channel. "I knew she was a fighter, but I never saw this coming. If she's really skipped court and left the country, it's not just bad optics, it could be contempt." Meanwhile, Crockett's staff was stone silent, phones off email, replies paused, not a single tweet. But behind the scenes, the movement was instant. Her attorneys were already drafting motions, freezing assets, notifying federal liaisons, contacting the Office of International Judicial Assistance. The Hague Convention was about to become relevant. One floor above the courtroom, a legal intern named Callie Barnes was watching the drama play out on a muted TV in the courthouse lounge. She turned to a senior clerk and said quietly, "This isn't just a court case anymore," at 4:46 p.m. A second source confirmed the flight had landed Zurich International. Leavitt had cleared customs alone. The day had started with a skip deposition. It ended with headlines from coast to coast, questioning whether a former White House aide had just dodged federal proceedings by crossing the Atlantic. But what triggered this lawsuit in the first place, and why was Karoline Leavitt's name tied to an $80 million case that suddenly turned red hot overnight? The number 80 million wasn't just for effect. It came from months of internal calculations, expert assessments, and legal strategy meetings. Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't bluffing when she filed the suit, and anyone who read through the first 30 pages of the complaint knew that the lawsuit wasn't just about defamation, it was layered defamation, civil conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, And a rarely used charge that tied everything together: malicious coordination of misinformation, targeting a federal official under financial audit. It all went back to a key stretch during Crockett's first term in Congress. January through April, a series of anonymous news stories surfaced, hinting that she'd misused campaign donations. Most were published in second-tier outlets, but they spread fast. Screenshots flooded social media, podcasts picked it up. A short clip of Crockett being shouted at by reporters outside a coffee shop in Fort Worth was replayed hundreds of times behind the scenes, though Crockett was undergoing a routine ethics review, standard for newly elected members managing large sums of PAC money. The audit found nothing substantial, but by the time that was confirmed, the rumor mill had already done its damage. Crockett didn't rush into court for weeks. She stayed quiet. She spoke to close friends and aides in private, one of them her longtime assistant. Lena Rowe recalled the moment she made her decision. She was sitting on the floor in her office, shoes off, just sitting there cross-legged, rereading the same article about herself. For the third time, she didn't cry. She just said, "We have to go after the people who think they can lie and get away with it." That was the switch through a quiet investigation. Her team traced the source of several story placements back to a media relations firm in Arizona. From there, it got messier. The firm had ties very indirect, but provable, to a super PAC once linked to Leavitt's political consultancy. That was the first red flag. The second came from an email leak. Encrypted messages sent between two anonymous accounts were authenticated by a digital forensics firm in Los Angeles. The emails mentioned Crockett by name, discussed pushing bad optics during audit, and even referenced specific keywords to trigger media attention PAC misuse, internal watchdog probe, and possible fraud. One of the senders signed off with initials. KL, that detail alone, wouldn't have held up in court. But it didn't stand alone. A subpoena into the consultancy's bank transfers showed a one-time payment from a private donor group tied to Leavitt's former employer. The payment matched a suspicious invoice from the PR firm dated just 1 week before the smear story started. At that point, Crockett's legal team was certain it wasn't random. Someone had built a campaign to damage her credibility during a moment of vulnerability, and they had reason to believe Karoline Leavitt was at the center of it. The official lawsuit was filed on a Friday morning. In April, just before noon, the courthouse steps were quiet. No press conference, no statement from Crockett. But by 2:00 p.m., the PDF was online, and everything changed. Leavitt's spokesperson issued a 2-sentence reply. Later that day, these claims are politically motivated and false. We look forward to addressing them fully through the legal process. But there was no movement after that. No counterfiling, no request for dismissal. Just silence. Over the next few weeks, the case sat quietly in pretrial prep until the court approved an expedited schedule. Following evidence authentication. On Monday morning, it was the kind of procedural update that usually goes unnoticed. But for someone on the other side of it, it meant something serious was coming fast. That's why the missed deposition sent shockwaves. The timing was just too close. Too perfect by Tuesday evening. The lawsuit that had mostly flown under the radar was all anyone in Washington, D.C. was talking about. Lobbyists whispered about it in Ubers. Interns gossiped while waiting in line at Starbucks. Near Capitol Hill, it wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was becoming a moment, a longtime staffer for a centrist think tank in Baltimore. Put it bluntly, there's a line between playing politics and trying to ruin someone's name during a federal audit. If what Crockett's team says is true, then this wasn't just mudslinging. It was tactical sabotage. But what were the exact details of the accusations against Leavitt? And how far did the alleged network of planted stories and digital manipulation really go? At first glance, the smear campaign seemed like a series of poorly sourced stories from fringe sites, but the deeper Crockett's legal team dug, the more deliberate. Everything started to look. One article accused Crockett of using campaign funds to buy furniture for her D.C. apartment. Another claimed she had ties to a consulting firm, owned by her cousin, completely false. A third suggested she'd failed to disclose thousands in PAC contributions, citing internal documents, which turned out to be doctored on their own. These stories didn't make headlines, but they were never meant to. They were meant to circulate just enough to sow doubt, enough to build a shadow narrative that Crockett was under fire, that something was off, and once they took hold, the rumors stuck. The lawsuit's appendix detailed how 3 of the stories had been picked up verbatim by political Twitter accounts with track records of pushing coordinated content. Those accounts had something in common. They were all created within the same 3-month period and used similar phrasing words like money trail corruption pattern, and fake audit cleanup kept repeating. It wasn't organic, it was shaped. Crockett's legal team brought in a private digital intelligence firm based in Minneapolis. Their report tracked the domain registration of 2 of the blogs back to the same IP range used by a media contractor formerly tied to Leavitt's consulting agency. The digital footprint was messy but traceable. Like trying to follow scuffed shoe prints on a wet sidewalk, you had to squint. But the path was there. Then came the real bombshell. 2 confidential witnesses. Confidential. One was a former assistant at the Arizona PR firm. The other was an ex-freelancer who'd worked remotely on paid content campaigns. Both spoke under sealed depositions. Neither knew the other. Yet both mentioned the same alias. Katie Lee. Katie Lee wasn't in any formal records, but both witnesses claimed that's who gave final approval on the stories. One even recalled a video call where the voice on the line sounded young. Sharp and East Coast later during evidence review. A brief screen grab showed an account labeled KL. eDawn72 with admin access to the publishing dashboard. At that point, the name match wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was starting to take shape in the court complaint. Crockett's team argued that Katie Lee was a deliberate alias designed to shield Karoline Leavitt's involvement while allowing direct control over how and when false stories were pushed out. It also suggested coordination with alt accounts on Twitter, using burner email addresses and rotating phone numbers bought in bulk from online SIM marketplaces. There was also a brief mention of something even more bizarre, an encrypted Signal group chat labeled Clean Hands, where draft story headlines were shared, tweaked, and scheduled. The group, according to metadata, had 4 members. 2 were traced. One of them used a profile photo that matched a former aide from Leavitt's PAC days. Another used the same username that had posted anti-Crocker memes in several Facebook groups earlier that year. A former IT contractor who worked with Leavitt's consultancy gave a sworn statement saying he remembered hearing talk about online misfires and a need to stay 2 degrees removed from any publication that ran the material. He also claimed that employees were advised to use prepaid debit cards for transactions tied to outreach work, though no names were mentioned. Then there were the payments, 1 wire transfer. Caught the court's attention, a $22,000 transaction from a Shell LLC in Nevada to the PR firm. The memo line read, Q1 Media, push. That was a week before the biggest hit piece against Crockett went live. Crockett's team wasn't just building a defamation case. They were building a map, and every line on that map pointed back to a small circle of people, with Leavitt's name either adjacent or hovering just outside of direct involvement. The complaint's language was sharp but cautious. It never claimed Leavitt published the articles herself. Instead, it claimed she orchestrated them, approved budgets, approved narratives, used aliases, and remained close enough to control the messaging, but distant enough to deny involvement if it collapsed. One of the most chilling parts came from a statement given by Crockett herself. If I make a mistake, I own it. But when someone spends months trying to break you down with lies, especially while you're under review by your own government, then it's not just politics anymore, it's targeted harm. The court agreed to move the case forward based on the pattern of indirect attribution tied to verifiable harm. But to truly understand how this exploded, we need to hear the story from Crockett's side, from the woman whose career, name, and peace of mind were placed on the line without warning. Jasmine Crockett didn't storm onto the scene with flashy headlines or a viral moment. She got to Congress the hard way. Door knocking, community forums, long evenings in packed auditoriums, listening to people's fears. Her strength wasn't in sound bites, it was in showing up even when no cameras were around. So when the stories began to spread, she didn't panic. Not at first, she thought people would see through it. She figured the truth would catch up. But it didn't not fast enough. The first sign that something had shifted came during a fundraising dinner in Dallas. A longtime donor pulled her aside, held her hand a little too tightly, and said, "I want to believe in you, Jasmine. I really do. But I don't want to see your name on the evening news again." That stuck with her. She got back to her hotel that night and sat at the edge of the bed, phone in hand, reading through Twitter. Mentions she knew she shouldn't read. Her mother had texted earlier, "Ignore the noise, just do your work." But even her mother had called the next day to ask about the articles. "I didn't cry," Jasmine told a staffer later. "I just felt this strange pressure in my chest, like I had to explain myself to people. I never even met inside her DC office." The energy changed. A few junior staffers started second-guessing press releases. One asked if they should hold off on public events until the audit clears. Her chief of staff, Nolan Reese, shut that down immediately. "We're not going underground," he told the room. She didn't do anything wrong, but the air was heavy, like someone had let a slow leak of doubt inside the walls, and no one could plug it. Then came the audit report. Clean, no misuse, no red flags, just a footnote correction on a filing date. It should have put everything to rest. But by then, people had already made up their minds. One staffer called it a fog of accusation. The kind that follows you, even when you walk into a room with nothing to hide. Crockett tried to move on. She kept working, kept attending hearings, kept pushing bills forward, but in the back of her mind, she couldn't let it go. Not because it hurt her pride, but because it felt like someone had tried to erase her name before she'd even built her full legacy. So she asked for help. Her longtime friend, Layla Patterson, a former civil rights attorney in Baton Rouge, flew up for a weekend. They sat in Jasmine's apartment, eating takeout, watching a documentary. Neither of them paid attention to, "What if I let it go?" Jasmine asked at one point. Layla leaned back on the couch. "And what would that teach the next woman? Who gets dragged just because she's visible? That silence works." That was the conversation that changed everything. Within days, Crockett's team had quietly hired a research firm. Within weeks, the legal wheels were turning. But it wasn't revenge. She was after. It was clarity. "I don't need her to fall apart," Jasmine said about Leavitt during a closed meeting. "I just need the record to show what actually happened. I need people to know this wasn't some accident." Even as the lawsuit moved forward, Crockett kept showing up. She didn't talk about the case publicly, didn't tweet cryptic messages. She wore her same plain suits and kept her meetings on schedule, but those close to her noticed something shift in her tone. She was still composed, but sharper, less patient with interruptions, less willing to smile through misinformation. One moment in particular stood out to Nolan. They were on a video call with community leaders from East Texas. Someone asked about political unity and reaching across the aisle. Jasmine paused, then said, "I'll work with anyone who tells the truth, but if you weaponize lies, don't sit across from me like we're equals, because we're not." That line didn't go viral, but it landed in every corner of that call behind the curtain. Crockett was still grappling with the weight of what had happened, not just to her, but to the integrity of the office she held. She'd always believed in process. Now she believed in consequences too. But while she stayed focused and present, Karoline Leavitt was already making a move no one saw coming. Boarding a flight that would shift the entire case from courtroom drama to national mystery at 6:00 a.m. on Tuesday. A woman in a navy blue blazer, slim black trousers, and a beige travel bag rolled her carry-on past the British Airways counter at JFK's Terminal 7. She wore oversized sunglasses and moved with intention, quick but composed. The only reason anyone noticed her was because she wasn't supposed to be there. Not on that day. Not in that place. Karoline Leavitt had a court deposition scheduled in San Diego. She wasn't on the no-fly list. She hadn't been charged with a crime, but the expectation was simple. Show up. Sit down, answer questions. Instead, she disappeared into the crowd at one of the world's busiest airports. It wasn't until an airline supervisor flagged her ID, registered under a variation of her middle and last name, that things started to feel odd. The name on the manifest wasn't Karoline Leavitt, but it was close enough to raise eyebrows, especially for someone who'd worked a few years in political security. The flight Zurich. Non-stop scheduled to leave at 8:00 a.m., that part checked out the supervisor, who would later speak off. Records said the woman didn't seem scared, just very focused. Like someone walking into a meeting they'd rehearsed 100 times. Around the same time, a baggage crew member took a photo. He wasn't trying to catch Leavitt. He was documenting the unusually high number of luxury bags being loaded onto the flight. But in the corner of one image, there she was. Head turned slightly, sunglasses on, walking toward the jet bridge. The timestamp matched the security log by 9:00 a.m. That photo had been texted to a reporter in Washington, D.C. She didn't run the story immediately. At first, she thought it was a mix-up, but then a second source chimed in, a TSA officer who had handled a pre-check scan for a high-profile individual flying under secondary credentials. He didn't name her, but he didn't have to. At 10:00 a.m., the story hit Twitter. Breaking: Karoline Leavitt may have just boarded a flight to Zurich. Her deposition was scheduled for today in CA. What's going on? It wasn't definitive, but it spread like gasoline under a match. Cable networks were slow to pick it up. Still waiting for confirmations, but by lunchtime, screenshots of the photo were circulating in political group chats across DC, Dallas, and even Sacramento staffers were passing phones around in elevators. Newsrooms were buzzing. One reporter on the tarmac confirmed the jet had departed at 8:00 a.m., a few minutes behind schedule, not unusual, by 1:30 p.m. EST, a second leak emerged. A staffer close to Leavitt's former campaign shared a message she had received late Monday night. It read, "I'll be off the grid for a few. Don't let the headlines spin. Your truth takes longer than gossip. No context. No location tag." Just that, it felt like damage control had started before the damage even hit. Meanwhile, at the courthouse in San Diego, Karoline's absence had been officially recorded. Her legal team stayed tight, lipped the lead counsel. A man named Silas Benton simply told the judge, "We'll respond in writing." The judge didn't wait. He ordered immediate verification of her location. Through federal channels within hours, an emergency motion was filed by Crockett's attorneys to secure Leavitt's known assets. Bank accounts, properties, consultancy holdings, all flagged. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't even a criminal pursuit, but it sent a message: leaving the country doesn't mean you leave the case. Back at JFK, a customs officer who'd briefly seen Leavitt pass through clearance said she didn't appear flustered. She looked like she'd done this before. He said, like she was used to having people not question her. She boarded, she flew. She landed. The Zurich arrival was confirmed at 9:05 p.m. local time. She cleared immigration using the same alternate credentials. Alone, no entourage, no handlers, just Karoline, a carry-on, and a document folder tucked under her arm. The cameras didn't catch her on the ground. She disappeared into the crowd again, just as easily as she had back in New York. But her sudden absence created a vacuum. And in that silence, the courtroom reacted with quiet urgency, setting the stage for a new phase. No one had quite prepared for back in San Diego. Word of Leavitt's flight reached the courtroom faster than some of the clerks could fully process it. The judge had just wrapped a separate motion hearing when his clerk quietly handed him a print out of the grainy airport photo. He stared at it for a moment, adjusted his glasses, and leaned toward his microphone. Let the record show that Miss Leavitt is not present, and there are developing indications she may have left the United States within the past 24 hours. That wasn't just a note for the file. That was the court formally acknowledging something had shifted. Jasmine Crockett sat beside her attorney, arms folded but calm. No sudden reactions, just a small breath, measured steady, like someone who already knew what she was about to hear. Silas Benton Leavitt's attorney didn't object. He just asked for time to verify his client's whereabouts. The judge didn't give him much. "We're not speculating," he said. "But if she's out of the country and there was no prior notice to the court, then we have a procedural issue. And if it's intentional, we're on the edge of contempt." That was the legal language. But in the hallway outside the courtroom, the mood was different. Whispers passed between interns and junior lawyers, like a current one clerk scrolled through Twitter, wide-eyed reading theories about Leavitt's departure. Was it tactical? Was it fear? Or was it arrogance? Back inside Crockett's team, a move fast. They filed an emergency request to freeze Leavitt's liquid assets and limit any further transfers. From her consulting firm's primary account, the judge signed off on it that afternoon by 2:45 p.m. That request had already been transmitted to financial compliance offices across multiple banks in Texas, Utah, and Florida states, where Leavitt had done business over the past 5 years. Her name didn't need to be on every account. The case was now running on connection patterns, trails, the legal equivalent of following footprints through a thin layer of dust. Evidence that's quiet, but not invisible. At the Department of Justice's West Coast Liaison Office, an international request form began to take shape. They were preparing for the next step invoking judicial cooperation through the Hague Convention. It was rare, especially in a civil case, but the judge had made it clear Leavitt's absence changed the tone. This wasn't just a political dispute anymore. This was a legal crisis in motion. Meanwhile, Crockett didn't speak to the press. She stepped into a black SUV after the hearing and was gone within minutes. But her attorney, Nadine Evers, paused briefly at the top of the courthouse steps when asked if they believed Leavitt had intentionally fled. She didn't take the bait. "We're not interested in drama," she said plainly. "We're interested in accountability." Back in the courtroom, a court reporter scribbled notes on everything. It was subtle, but you could feel it. The gears of the legal system tightening quiet consequences. Nothing dramatic. No headlines screamed across marble floors. Just deadlines, motions, verified timestamps. Silent paperwork doing the heavy lifting. At one point in the hallway, a young paralegal leaned against the wall and muttered, "I don't think anyone thought she'd actually go." Someone replied, "That's because they underestimated how far someone will run to avoid saying something under oath." By evening, an internal memo had been sent out to every legal team tied to the case. Prepare for international coordination. There would be no waiting to see if Leavitt would come back voluntarily. The next court session was scheduled for the following week, but the tone had already changed. What was once an orderly process now had urgency pulsing beneath the surface. The judge issued a final comment before adjourning. "If the court confirms that the defendant has knowingly left the country to avoid appearance, we will proceed under all applicable statutes. Intent will matter, that one word." Intent was now at the heart of the case. But while the legal machinery kicked into motion, something else was happening. Silence. No tweets. No press releases. No lawyer standing outside a courthouse making excuses. Just a growing, deliberate quiet from Karoline Leavitt's camp. By Wednesday morning, the quiet was loud. Not a single word from Karoline Leavitt's team. No press release. No tweet. No correction. No denial for a figure who had once thrived on media presence. Someone who knew how to steer headlines and stir momentum. This kind of silence didn't just feel unusual. It felt calculated. Reporters flooded inboxes. called known staffers, reached out to former aides. Nothing. A few numbers had been disconnected. One assistant who had previously managed Leavitt's press scheduling replied to a text with just 2 words. Not involved. Her official website remained unchanged. No updates. No statement. Just a frozen homepage with her signature photo and a vague mission statement. Her consultancy's public relations team, meanwhile, had quietly taken down the media inquiries tab. That morning, a local affiliate in Tampa tried to contact her legal representative, Silas Benton. He answered, but briefly. "I don't have a comment at this time. When I do, I'll make sure it's with the court first." Then he hung up the press, took that as confirmation. Leavitt's legal strategy had shifted, and maybe so had her priorities. The silence didn't stop the digging, a former intern. Megan Estevez, who worked for Leavitt during her brief congressional campaign, 2 years earlier shared her experience anonymously with a freelance reporter. She described the last time she saw Karoline in person, just 5 days before the deposition was scheduled. She looked distracted, not stressed, but like her mind was somewhere else. Megan recalled she didn't make eye contact much. She kept checking her phone when she left that afternoon. She told me, "No matter what happens next, stay focused on your own path." I thought it was about the campaign, but now she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to across multiple media circles. Rumors bubbled. One said Leavitt had cleared out a storage unit in Dallas the previous week. Another claimed her calendar had been wiped. From a shared scheduling platform used by her former staff, most couldn't be confirmed, but the sudden sharp disappearance of digital traces added fuel to the fire. Political strategist Angela Beaufort, who had crossed paths with Leavitt during the early days of the 2020 campaign cycle, made a quiet comment during a live panel discussion. She always knew how to control the narrative if she's quiet now. It's not because she doesn't have something to say. It's because she doesn't want it said out loud. Within Crockett's circle, the silence wasn't surprising. It was frustrating. "It's not even about the lawsuit anymore," said one staffer. "It's about respect. If you get accused of something and you know you're innocent, you fight. You don't vanish." Meanwhile, journalists dug into Leavitt's recent activity. One noticed she hadn't made a single donation or financial move through her LLC in over 10 days. Another pointed out a revoked application for a business license in Nevada. A small detail, but the timing aligned with her departure. One of the more telling pieces came from someone who hadn't been heard from in a long time. Daniel Shin, a policy analyst who once worked adjacent to Leavitt's consulting work, wrote a blog post titled "When Silence Screams." In it, he described a pattern he'd seen before: people in power falling back on silence. Not because they're unsure, but because the words they'd need to explain themselves might cause more damage than staying quiet. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a defense. It was an observation. And it resonated inside a coffee shop near Union Station. 2 Hill staffers sat in the corner booth, passing around the same theory over iced lattes. She's lawyered up full lockdown. She's not gone for good. She's buying time, maybe, but even among the politically hardened, the silence felt different this time. Usually, when public figures run into legal trouble, they come out swinging statements. Media appearances, carefully rehearsed narratives of innocence. But this time, all of that was missing. It left a gap, and people filled it with speculation, suspicion, and side conversations that carried more weight than any press release could have. But where words failed, the media machine kicked into overdrive, and soon Leavitt's absence became the story, pulling everyone into a storm of public reaction and political commentary that even silence couldn't hold back. By Thursday morning, the silence had reached its breaking point when a former White House aide skips a federal deposition and boards a plane to another country with no statement. The media doesn't stay patient. It reacts, and fast. Every major outlet scrambled to fill airtime. The facts were thin, but that didn't matter. The moment was too loud to ignore. Morning show hosts dissected grainy airport photos. Frame by frame, cable news anchors bounced between legal analysts and political commentators. No one had access to Karoline Leavitt. But that only made the story hotter. Speculation filled the space where facts had gone missing. On a 9 AM segment, a conservative host asked bluntly, "What kind of person dodges court in the middle of a civil lawsuit that big? You don't run unless you're hiding something." Meanwhile, a progressive commentator replied on another network she's been part of, "Disinformation campaigns for years. This looks like just another page out of her own playbook. Except this time, she's the one under the microscope clips." From both went viral. Social media was worse. Posts ranged from sarcastic memes. Leavitt photoshopped into a Swiss Alps ski resort to angry threads, accusing her of undermining legal accountability. Supporters tried to push back, calling the lawsuit political theater, but they were drowned out by a flood of reactions. One post read, "Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch when others were under pressure. Now it's her turn, and she vanishes." That's not strength. That's a pattern. It had 87,000 likes. By the end of the day, podcasts dedicated entire episodes to the story. Some called it an evasion. Others labeled it strategic withdrawal. But the consensus was clear. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a public reckoning. One show titled their episode "The Ghost Candidate," a nod to how fast Leavitt had gone from political up-and-comer to international ? Back in Washington. Journalists started circling Crockett's office. She still didn't speak, but her communications director released a short statement. By email, Representative Crockett is focused on the legal process. We trust the courts to handle this, and we will continue our work serving the people of Texas. It was the only thing that came out of her camp that day. No follow-up, no interviews, just calm professionalism. Starkly different from the frenzy outside, that contrast only fueled the narrative. Several editorial columns ran with the same theme. One woman shows up, the other disappears in Austin. A grassroots group organized a small rally in support of Crockett, holding signs that read "Truth still matters." And "We stand with Jasmine." It wasn't massive, but it drew local coverage, and it sent a signal. People weren't just watching. They were taking sides. Meanwhile, back at JFK, security staff were quietly questioned by federal agents, reviewing Leavitt's departure. No arrests, no pushback, just quiet documentation behind the scenes. Law enforcement was piecing together the timeline minute by minute, even as the media took leaps by the hour. A former federal prosecutor on a legal talk show was blunt. She's not been charged, not yet, but if she doesn't reappear soon, that clock starts ticking fast. The court will not tolerate being ignored. This isn't a campaign trail. This is law online. Hashtags trended for hours. Hash up show. Where is Karoline fleeing? Accountability justice for Crockett. But it wasn't just noise. It was pressure. And political figures began to feel it. A few elected officials released vague tweets about respecting the rule of law. Others ducked the question entirely. But one former congressional aide wrote something on his blog that stood out. It's never about the disappearance itself. It's about what it exposes, the trust gaps, the silence, the people we put on pedestals, and the ones we ignore until they fight back. By the end of the day, Leavitt's name was on every major political website, not for what she said, but for what she hadn't. The story had morphed into something larger than the lawsuit itself. It was now a question of accountability, of ethics, of what it means to face consequences when you've made a career of managing narratives. But while the media swirled and the headlines multiplied, the real weight of this moment was still landing hard on people with no cameras, no platforms, just the emotional toll of being caught in a battle that reached far beyond the courtroom, away from the newsrooms, beyond the trending hashtags and cable panel chatter. There were people living through this moment in quiet exhaustion. Not pundits, not politicians. Just the ones who had been closest to it all at Crockett's district office in Arlington, Texas. The phones didn't stop ringing. Some callers were offering support. Others were confused. A few left angry messages accusing her of trying to drag a young conservative woman down for political gain. Every staffer took a turn at answering. No one shouted back, they just listened. Took notes and tried to stay human in a job that demanded restraint. Lena Rowe, Crocker's assistant, was working past hours. Again, her desk was cluttered with sticky notes and printed articles, but her phone background stayed the same. A photo of her son holding a campaign sign. She hadn't seen him in person in 4 days. Every time she called home, he'd ask, "Are you winning?" She never had an answer for that. In the break room, Nolan Reese scrolled through an internal thread on his tablet, anxiety creeping into every message. A new intern had asked whether it was still safe to wear Crocker's campaign badge outside. Another asked if she should delete a tweet from last month that included the lawsuit's hashtag. They weren't worried about the legal battle. They were worried about the noise, the attacks, the private messages flooding inboxes, the subtle threats disguised as questions. This case wasn't just in court. It was leaking into everyday lives back in D.C. at a small advocacy nonprofit where Crockett used to volunteer executive director. Simone Gardner had been fielding media calls, nonstop, not for a comment, but for a quote about Jasmine's character. Every journalist seemed to want to before to contrast with the "now Simone refused, she's not a story" arc. She told one of them, "She's a person she didn't ask to be lied about. She didn't plan for this fight, but she's in it now, and she's doing it the way she always does." Head up, eyes forward, at a community center on the west side of Fort Worth. A group of high school girls were finishing up their after-school leadership program when one of them asked if Crockett was going to quit. "She won't." The mentor replied, "She doesn't know how." But while the pain was most visible around Crockett, it wasn't isolated to her circle. A young political writer in Phoenix, who had previously freelanced for one of the PR firms implicated in the lawsuit, broke down in tears during an anonymous interview. "I didn't know what I was writing was part of something bigger. I thought I was just writing edgy content. It wasn't even my headline. They gave me the script now. I feel like I helped hurt someone. I didn't even know another former employee from the same firm who left months earlier. Quietly told a friend, I'm scared someone's going to knock on my door and ask what I knew, because the truth is I knew enough." Even Crockett's mother, a retired elementary school teacher, had started avoiding local news every time she saw her daughter's face on screen. It felt like a new bruise. She called Jasmine late at night, once asking, "Are you okay?" even when you're smiling for the cameras. Jasmine's reply was simple. "I don't need to be okay right now. I just need to be honest." Honesty had become the only armor left. The pressure on her team was enormous. No sleep, no margin for error, no dramatic outbursts, just relentless precision in the face of public scrutiny. They weren't just defending a lawsuit, they were defending their belief that truth still mattered, even when it got drowned out by noise. At the same time, the lawsuit was slowly inspiring people who hadn't paid attention before. A group of young legal students in Sacramento launched a weekly newsletter analyzing the case in plain language. A retired judge in Oklahoma wrote a blog post about the importance of witness credibility. These were small ripples, but real. Everyone had their own version of the story. But those closest to the fallout carried something heavier. The weight of knowing the person behind the headlines, knowing how it feels to work your whole life for something, only to watch it get questioned by someone who never even looked you in the eye. But as the emotional weight spread, and the damage continued to show in quiet corners, one question remained: what lesson is left when the headlines fade and the cameras turn away? When the noise calmed just a little, you could finally hear what wasn't being said. No dramatic declarations, no public apologies, no declarations of innocence or guilt. Just silence headlines aging by the hour, and people still waiting for someone to make sense of what just happened for Jasmine Crockett. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. She had followed the rules. She waded through an audit. She stayed composed when whispers grew louder than facts. And when it became clear that someone was pulling strings behind the scenes, she chose to act not with press conferences or personal attacks, but with paperwork strategy and discipline. The truth didn't protect her from the damage, but it gave her direction. One of her volunteers, a woman named Yvette, with streaks of gray through her braids, said it best during a weekend food drive in Dallas. Sometimes The only way to win is not to break. That's what stuck with people. Crockett didn't break. She didn't match smear with smear. She stayed where she was supposed to be, present, working, showing up, even when half the internet seemed determined to spin her into a villain and leave it. She was still gone. Her silence might have been a legal tactic, a personal decision, or a calculated pause. No one really knew, but the longer she stayed away, the more her absence became its own kind of statement. The kind that makes people fill in the blanks. One former campaign staffer from her congressional run said something that caught a lot of people off guard. She was always sharp, always 3 steps ahead, but she never stayed long in one place. And when the pressure came, she did what she always did. Moved, not everyone saw her as guilty. Some believed the case was exaggerated. Some argued she was being used as a political scapegoat. But even her defenders couldn't explain why she left without a word, why she skipped a deposition, why, when accountability knocked, she didn't even answer the door. That's what people remember. Not the case. Details, not the digital trail, not the headlines. They remember who showed up and who didn't. And in that contrast, something quiet and clear began to take shape. When leadership is challenged, people don't want perfection. They want presence. They want to see the people they voted for, the ones who speak boldly on stages, sit down when it matters most, face hard questions, own their decisions, even when it's messy, even when it hurts. Because at the end of the day, it's not about lawsuits or strategy memos. It's about what kind of person you are when no one's clapping for you, when it's just you and the truth and a chair with your name on it in a courtroom. And whether you sit in it, Jasmine Crockett sat, and for all the noise, all the pressure, all the questions, she kept showing up. Maybe the story won't end neatly. Maybe there won't be a final headline that gives everyone closure. But something lasting was left behind in the middle of it all. A reminder. Character isn't built during the campaign trail. It's tested in moments like this. So whether you're in politics or not, remember what this moment showed: that silence can speak. That absence can wound. That showing up even when it's hard is a kind of power that no smear campaign can touch. And maybe that's the real story. Not the lawsuit, not the flight, but the choice each person made when the pressure closed in. If this moment meant something to you, if it reminded you that truth, integrity, and presence still matter, then don't let it pass. Subscribe for more stories that look beneath the surface. And share this with someone who's tired of watching people run when things get hard.